The war had taken everything from Martha Vogel: her husband, her home in Dresden, her sense of safety, her belief that the world could ever be good again. Now, at 38 years old, with a 6-year-old son clinging to her skirts, she sat in the dim office of Father Anselm's charity organization in Hamburg, listening to words that felt like stones dropping into her stomach. No family wants an old German widow. That's what the American liaison had said, barely looking up from his paperwork as he shuffled through applications from dozens of desperate women just like her. Too old, too damaged, too German. The young pretty girls, the ones barely 20 with bright eyes and no children, no visible scars from the bombing raids. They were the ones American soldiers wanted to bring home as war brides. Fresh starts with fresh faces, girls who could pretend the war had never happened. Not someone like her, with worry lines etched deep around her eyes and mouth, with a child who hadn't spoken a single word since witnessing their apartment building collapse during the firebombing of Dresden. Father Anselm had tried to soften the blow, speaking in gentle tones about God's plan and patience, but Martha heard the truth clearly enough beneath his kindness. She was nobody's first choice, nobody's dream of a fresh start in America, nobody's vision of a happy future. But then Father Anselm mentioned one more name, his voice dropping as if he wasn't entirely sure he should be sharing this information. One last possibility, he said, pulling a worn envelope from the bottom of a stack of correspondence. A farmer in Nebraska, a place Martha had never heard of. A man named Virgil Drummond, who had written a letter so different from all the others that had crossed Father Anselm's desk. He wasn't looking for a pretty young thing to show off at church socials or a decorative wife to hang on his arm at community gatherings. He was looking for someone who understood loss, someone who knew what it meant to rebuild from ashes, someone who had lived through darkness and come out the other side scarred but standing. He had worked alongside German prisoners of war on his farm during the conflict, and one of them, a man named Ernst Schaefer from Munich, had told him stories about the women back home, the widows struggling to survive in the ruins of bombed-out cities with no men, no jobs, no hope. Virgil had lost his own wife 3 years earlier to pneumonia, a slow death that had left him helpless and angry, and his sprawling farm in the Nebraska plains had become a lonely place afterward. Too quiet, too empty, too full of ghosts and memories that hurt to touch. He was 45 years old and figured his chance at family had passed him by, that he would spend the rest of his days working the land alone until age or accident took him. But something about Ernst's stories had stayed with him through the long winter nights when the wind howled across the empty fields and the house creaked with emptiness. Ernst had spoken of his sister, widowed at 32 with 3 children, living in a basement in what remained of Munich, trading family heirlooms for bread, watching her children grow thin and hollow-eyed. Ernst had cried telling that story, and Virgil had listened, and something had shifted in him. Maybe, he thought during those long, dark nights, 2 broken people could help each other become whole again. Maybe loneliness in Nebraska and desperation in Germany could somehow add up to something like hope. It was a strange calculation, he knew, probably foolish, but he had written to Father Anselm anyway, carefully composing a letter that took him 3 drafts to get right, explaining his situation and his offer. Martha stared at the letter Father Anselm handed her now, written in careful English she could barely understand, the words swimming before her tired eyes. But she understood the photograph clipped to it with a bent paperclip. A tall, weathered man standing in front of a white farmhouse that looked impossibly clean and whole, his expression serious but not unkind, his hands hanging at his sides as if he didn't quite know what to do with them. Behind him stretched fields that seemed to go on forever under an enormous sky, bigger than any sky Martha had ever seen, a sky that looked like it could swallow you whole or set you free. It looked like a different planet compared to the rubble and ash of post-war Germany, compared to the broken buildings and hollow-eyed people, and constant gray despair that had become her entire world. Father Anselm translated slowly, his finger moving along the lines of Virgil's letter, his voice quiet in the small office. Virgil Drummond was offering something almost unheard of, something that seemed too good to be true and probably was. He would sponsor her and Oscar, arrange their passage across the Atlantic, pay for their travel and documentation, and ask nothing in return except honest work and companionship. If marriage came later, fine. If not, she and her son would still have a roof over their heads and food on the table, a guarantee of safety and stability. He had a small cottage on his property where they could stay, their own space, their own door they could lock if they wanted. He just didn't want to be alone anymore, and he figured she probably felt the same way. Martha's hands trembled as she held the letter, the paper crinkling under her fingers. Every practical bone in her body screamed that this was madness, that she was considering walking into a trap, that no man offered something for nothing. America was an ocean away, a place she had only seen in films before the war, in those Hollywood pictures that had seemed like fairy tales even then. She would be completely dependent on a stranger, a man whose language she barely spoke, whose customs she didn't understand, in a country that had just finished fighting hers, that had dropped bombs on her cities and killed her neighbors. What if he was cruel? What if he had lied in his letter and expected things she couldn't give? What if he changed his mind once she arrived and she found herself stranded in a foreign country with no money and no way home? What if the neighbors treated her like the enemy, spat on her in the street, hurt her child? The fears multiplied in her mind like rats in the dark, each one feeding the others until she could barely breathe. But then she looked down at Oscar, sitting silent on the floor of Father Anselm's office, playing with a wooden horse someone had donated to the charity, his small face so serious, so closed off from the world. Her son deserved better than this limbo, better than the suspicious stares and the constant hunger and the cold that seeped into their bones in the unheated room they shared with 4 other families. She thought about the alternative, staying in Germany, competing with millions of other widows for scraps of work, watching Oscar grow up in the shadow of defeat and destruction, seeing him become hard and bitter before he even reached adolescence. At least in Nebraska there would be space to breathe. At least there she could try to give her son something resembling a childhood, something with fresh air and open fields and enough food. At least there, they might have a chance. She looked up at Father Anselm, this kind priest who had helped so many desperate women, and nodded slowly, her decision made even though her heart was pounding with fear. She would go. She would take this impossible chance with this stranger named Virgil Drummond. Because when you have already lost everything, when you have watched your husband die, and your city burn, and your entire world collapse, you have nothing left to lose. The worst had already happened. Anything else was just details. Within 3 weeks, Martha and Oscar were standing on the deck of a converted troop transport ship in Bremerhaven, watching the broken coastline of Europe disappear into the gray Atlantic mist. The ship still smelled of soldiers and diesel fuel, and their cabin was a cramped berth below deck that they shared with 6 other women and their children, all of them war brides heading to America with hope and terror in their eyes. The voyage took 12 days. 12 days of seasickness and uncertainty, of Oscar's small hand gripping hers as the ship rolled through rough waters that seemed determined to swallow them whole. Martha spent hours on deck when the weather allowed, staring at the endless ocean and wondering what waited on the other side. The other passengers, mostly war brides married to American servicemen who had courted them properly with flowers and promises, kept their distance once they learned she was German rather than French or British or Dutch. The few who spoke to her did so in whispers, as if her nationality might be contagious, as if association with her might taint them by proximity. One woman, a French girl barely 19 married to a soldier from Texas, told Martha bluntly that she should be ashamed to show her face, that Germans had no right to seek happiness in America after what they had done. Martha had no answer to that. What could she say? That she had never supported the war? That she had lost as much as anyone? It sounded hollow, even in her own mind. So she kept to herself and Oscar, counting down the hours until they reached New York Harbor, praying that Virgil Drummond would actually be there, that this wasn't all some elaborate, cruel joke. When the Statue of Liberty finally appeared through the morning fog on the 12th day, Martha felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a tiny, fragile spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this would work. Maybe she and Oscar could build something new here, could leave the ashes of the old world behind and become different people. The processing at Ellis Island was overwhelming, a chaos of languages and paperwork, and officials stamping documents with mechanical efficiency. Martha clutched the letter from Virgil like a lifeline, showing it to anyone who questioned her presence, her right to be there. She was not a war bride in the traditional sense, but the paperwork Father Anselm had arranged classified her as a sponsored immigrant under a special provision, something about agricultural workers and farm labor shortages. It was all legal, all proper, even if the immigration officer looked at her with barely concealed skepticism, his eyes lingering on her worn clothes and her silent child. "What's wrong with the boy?" he asked, and Martha had to explain in halting English that Oscar had been traumatized by the war, that he would speak again when he felt safe. The officer stamped their papers without comment, his face impassive, and waved them through. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 90 minutes, they were cleared through customs, and Martha found herself standing in the massive hall of Grand Central Terminal, surrounded by noise and movement and more people than she had seen in one place since before the bombing of Dresden. The scale of it was overwhelming, the soaring ceiling and the crowds and the incomprehensible announcements echoing off marble walls. Virgil had written that he would meet them there, that he would be wearing a brown hat and carrying a sign with her name. Martha scanned the crowd nervously. Oscar pressed against her side, both of them exhausted and overwhelmed and terrified. What if he didn't come? What if she had misunderstood and he was waiting somewhere else? What if he had changed his mind? And then she saw him, taller than she had expected, broad-shouldered and sun-weathered, standing perfectly still amid the chaos with a hand-lettered sign that read, "Martha Vogel and Oscar," in careful block letters. He stood like a tree in a storm, unmoved by the rushing crowds around him, his eyes scanning the terminal with patient determination. Their eyes met across the crowded space, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Martha felt her breath catch. This was real. This was actually happening. Then Virgil walked toward her slowly, as if approaching a skittish animal, and removed his hat in an old-fashioned gesture of respect. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the gray threading through his dark hair, the calluses on his hands that spoke of decades of hard work. He looked tired, she thought. He looked lonely. He looked kind. He spoke first, his voice deep and quiet, almost lost in the noise of the terminal. "You must be Martha. I'm Virgil Drummond. Welcome to America." Then he tried a phrase in German, clearly memorized from a phrase book, his pronunciation terrible but the effort touching something in her chest. "Willkommen in America. Ich hoffe, die Reise war nicht zu schwer." Martha felt tears prick her eyes at the sound of her native language, however mangled. She responded in her broken English, her accent thick and uncertain, the words feeling clumsy in her mouth. "Thank you, Mr. Drummond. This is Oscar, my son. We are grateful to be here." Virgil looked down at the small boy and slowly crouched to his level, not reaching out, not crowding him, just meeting him eye to eye with quiet respect. He pulled something from his coat pocket, a carved wooden horse, simple but beautifully made, the wood smooth and golden. Oscar's eyes widened, the first real expression Martha had seen on his face in months, a crack in the wall he had built around himself. Virgil held it out without a word, patient, letting the boy decide. After a long hesitation, Oscar reached out and took it, his small fingers closing around the toy with something like wonder. Virgil stood back up and met Martha's gaze, and she saw understanding there, a recognition of trauma that needed no explanation. "The train to Nebraska leaves in 3 hours. I got us a compartment. You both must be exhausted. Let's get you home." Home. The word sounded strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once. They boarded the train westward, and Martha watched through the window as America unfolded before her like a storybook. Cities gave way to towns, towns to farmland, the landscape growing flatter and wider until the sky seemed to swallow everything, and the horizon became a distant dream. Virgil didn't talk much during the journey, but his presence was steady and calm, a quiet anchor in the chaos of new sights and sounds. He bought them meals in the dining car, showing Martha how to order, helping her navigate the English menu. He showed Oscar how the seats converted into beds, demonstrated the small fold-down table, pointed out landmarks through the window with brief explanations. A river. Those are the Appalachian Mountains. That's farmland, corn mostly. Martha found herself relaxing slightly, though she remained alert, still waiting for the trap to spring, for this kindness to reveal its price. But Virgil asked nothing of her except patience and the occasional question about her comfort. "Are you warm enough? Is Oscar hungry? Do you need anything?" When they finally arrived at the small station in Nebraska after 2 days of travel, he loaded their meager belongings into a dusty truck and drove them down long dirt roads between endless fields of young corn that rippled in the wind like a green ocean. The farm appeared gradually. First the windmill spinning lazily against the blue sky, then the barn, Red and weathered but solid. Then the white two-story house she had seen in the photograph. It looked impossibly clean and whole compared to everything she had left behind, like something from a dream or a painting. Virgil parked the truck and helped them down, his hand steadying her elbow as she climbed out stiffly, then led them not to the main house but to a smaller cottage about 50 yards away, connected by a worn footpath through the grass. He pushed open the door to reveal a simple but spotless interior, a main room with a wood stove and table, a bedroom with 2 beds already made up with clean quilts, a small bathroom with actual running water that seemed like an impossible luxury. Curtains hung in the windows, cheerful yellow fabric that let in the afternoon light. Someone had left fresh bread and milk on the counter, along with butter and jam and a bowl of eggs. "I fixed it up as best I could," Virgil said, his voice uncertain for the first time, almost apologetic. "It's not much, but it's yours. You don't owe me anything, Martha. You work if you want to work, you rest if you need to rest. I'm just glad you're here. I'm glad you took the chance." Martha walked slowly through the little cottage, touching the walls as if to confirm they were real, running her fingers over the smooth wood of the table, the soft fabric of the curtains. It was more than she had dared hope for, this clean, safe space, this quiet refuge. Oscar climbed onto one of the beds and bounced slightly, testing it, the wooden horse still clutched in his hand, and Martha saw something like happiness flicker across his face. She turned to Virgil, and for the first time since her husband died, tears spilled down her cheeks without restraint. Not sad tears, not entirely. Something more complicated. Relief and grief and gratitude all tangled together into something that had no name. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you for this chance. Thank you for seeing us as human." Virgil nodded, clearly uncomfortable with emotion, his own eyes suspiciously bright, and backed toward the door. "I'll let you settle in. Come up to the main house when you're ready. No rush. Take your time." And then he was gone, leaving them alone in their new home. Martha sank into a chair and let herself cry properly while Oscar, sensing something had shifted, that they had finally reached solid ground after months of free fall, crawled into her lap and held her tight. They had made it. Against all odds, across an ocean and a continent, they had made it to this quiet farm in Nebraska, to this unexpected second chance, to this strange new life with a lonely farmer who had raised his hand when no one else would. The first weeks were an adjustment neither of them could have prepared for. Martha woke each morning in the cottage, still half expecting to hear air raid sirens or the sound of buildings collapsing, or the screams that had filled her nights in Germany. Instead, there was only birdsong and the distant lowing of cattle, and the whisper of wind through the corn, sounds so peaceful they almost hurt. She began slowly, learning the rhythms of the farm, helping where she could despite the language barrier that made everything twice as difficult. Virgil was patient beyond measure, showing her tasks with gestures and simple words, never pushing, never demanding, never making her feel stupid for not understanding. She gathered eggs from the chicken coop, marveling at the abundance of food after years of hunger. She helped hang laundry on the line, the simple domesticity of it strange and wonderful. She learned to operate the hand pump for water, to feed the pigs, to recognize which tools were for which tasks. Oscar began to explore cautiously, venturing a little farther from the cottage each day, though he still didn't speak, and still startled at sudden noises. Virgil seemed to understand this without explanation, never forcing the boy into conversation, just leaving small gifts where Oscar would find them. Another carved animal, a smooth stone from the creek, a bird's nest that had fallen from a tree, treasures that spoke of a world where beauty still existed, but the outside world was less understanding than Virgil's quiet farm. The first Sunday, Virgil asked if they would like to attend church with him in town. Martha agreed, hoping it might help them integrate into the community, that it might show people she meant no harm. She dressed Oscar in his best clothes, worn but clean and carefully mended, and climbed into the truck beside Virgil for the drive into the small town of Millbrook, population 800 and dwindling as young people left for cities. The church was white clapboard with a tall steeple, and as they walked up the steps, Martha felt the stairs like physical touches, like hands pushing against her chest. The congregation fell silent as they entered, every head turning to look at the German widow and her son, conversations dying mid-sentence. the organ music suddenly seeming too loud in the quiet. Virgil led them to a pew near the front, his jaw set, his hand briefly touching Martha's elbow in a gesture of support and solidarity. They sat, and slowly the service began, the pastor recovering his composure and beginning the liturgy. But Martha could feel the hostility radiating from the pews behind them like heat from a stove, could hear the whispers that weren't quite quiet enough. After the service, as they stood on the church steps blinking in the bright sunlight, a woman approached with the deliberate stride of someone on a mission. She was perhaps 60, impeccably dressed in a navy suit with a pearl brooch with steel gray hair styled in perfect waves and a smile that didn't reach her cold blue eyes. Mrs. Eleanor Kittredge, she introduced herself, president of the Ladies' Auxiliary and Virgil's nearest neighbor, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Her gaze swept over Martha with undisguised disapproval, taking in every detail of her worn dress and scuffed shoes and foreign features. "So this is your German, Virgil. How charitable of you." The word dripped with condescension, with the implication that charity was foolish and misplaced. Martha understood enough English to catch the tone, if not all the words, and she felt her face burn with shame and anger. Virgil's voice went cold in a way Martha hadn't heard before, a steel edge entering his usually gentle tone. "This is Martha Vogel and her son Oscar. They're part of my household now, Eleanor, and they'll be treated with respect in this community." Mrs. Kittredge's smile tightened into something that looked almost like a snarl. "Of course, Virgil. We all admire your Christian charity, truly we do. But you must understand how it looks, bringing one of them here after everything that happened. My nephew died in France, you know, blown apart by a German shell. Many families in this town lost sons to her people." Martha wanted to disappear, to sink into the ground and cease to exist. She knew this would happen, had braced herself for it during the long voyage across the Atlantic. But the reality was still crushing, still more painful than she had imagined. Before Virgil could respond with the anger she could see building in his face, she spoke up in her halting English, forcing the words out even though her voice shook. "I am sorry for your loss, Mrs. I lost my husband also. I lost my home. I lost my city. War is terrible for everyone, for all sides. We all bleed the same." Mrs. Kittredge looked startled that Martha had spoken, that the German woman had a voice and opinions. Then her expression hardened further into something ugly and unmovable. "It's not the same thing at all, dear. Your husband was fighting for the wrong side. He chose evil. Our boys were heroes. There was nothing Virgil or Martha could say to that. The truth of it hung in the air, undeniable and painful, a wall that could not be climbed or broken through with words. Virgil took Martha's arm gently but firmly. "We'll be going now. Good day, Eleanor." He guided Martha and Oscar back to the truck, and they drove home in heavy silence, the joy of the morning completely destroyed. Martha stared out the window at the passing fields, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake, if she would ever be anything more than the enemy in this place, if Oscar would grow up hated for sins he hadn't committed. That evening, after a quiet supper where none of them ate much, Virgil knocked on the cottage door. Martha opened it to find him standing on the step, hat in his hands, looking uncomfortable and determined at the same time. "Can I come in for a minute?" She stepped aside and he entered, glancing at Oscar, who was already asleep in the bedroom, exhausted by the emotional weight of the day. Virgil sat at the small table and gestured for Martha to join him. When she did, he leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his expression serious. "I want to apologize for Eleanor Kittredge and folks like her. This town has seen a lot of loss, and people need someone to blame for their pain. It's not right, but it's how they are. You didn't do anything wrong, Martha. You and Oscar, you're just trying to survive, same as anyone, same as all of us. You're not responsible for the war any more than I'm responsible for the bombs we dropped on your cities." Martha folded her hands on the table, choosing her words carefully in her limited English. "In Germany, they say I am traitor for coming here, for leaving, for choosing America. In America, they say I am enemy for being German. Where do I belong, Mr. Drummond? Where is there a place for people like me and Oscar?" Virgil was quiet for a long moment, staring at his calloused hands. Then he reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. The first time he had really touched her with intention. "You belong here, Martha, on this farm. With me, if you'll have it. I know this isn't what either of us planned for our lives. I know it's hard and strange and probably scary as hell. But I meant what I said in my letter to Father Anselm. I don't want to be alone anymore, and I don't think you do either. We can build something here, the three of us. Something good and solid. It won't be easy, and people like Eleanor will talk no matter what we do. But I think we can make it work. I think we can make a family out of this strange situation. If you're willing to try. If you're willing to stay. Martha looked down at his hand covering hers, rough and warm and steady, the hand of a man who kept his promises. She thought about the long road that had brought her here, all the loss and fear and desperate choices that had led to this moment. And she thought about the alternative, going back to nothing, to nowhere, to a Germany that didn't want her anymore. Slowly, she turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his, the gesture feeling momentous and right. I will try, Mr. Drummond. For Oscar and for me, I will try. We will make this work together. Something shifted between them after that night, a door opening that had been closed before. It was subtle, a gradual warming like spring thaw after a long winter. Virgil started taking his meals at the cottage instead of the main house, the three of them sitting together at the small table, passing dishes and learning each other's rhythms and preferences. Martha began to pick up English more quickly, and Virgil surprised her by attempting to learn German, though his pronunciation was so terrible it made Oscar smile for the first time, a tiny crack in the boy's silence that felt like a miracle. They worked the farm together, Martha proving herself stronger and more capable than Virgil had expected. She had grown up on a small farm outside Dresden before the war, and her hands remembered the work even if the landscape and methods were different. She learned to drive the tractor, to mend fences with wire and posts, to help with the livestock during calving season. Virgil watched her with growing respect and something else, something deeper that made Martha's heart beat faster when she caught him looking at her across the field or over the dinner table. Summer arrived in full force, the Nebraska heat nothing like the temperate climate Martha remembered from home. It was a dry heat that baked the earth and made the air shimmer, that turned the sky a hard bright blue and the corn a deep green. The work was endless, dawn to dusk and sometimes beyond, but there was a satisfaction in it that Martha hadn't felt in years. She was building something instead of just surviving, contributing instead of begging, making a life instead of enduring existence. Oscar began to come out of his shell slowly, following Virgil around the farm like a small shadow, learning to feed the chickens and collect eggs and identify different birds by their calls. Virgil taught him with the same patience he showed Martha, never pushing, always encouraging, treating the boy like he mattered. One evening in late July, as they sat on the porch of the cottage watching fireflies dance in the twilight, the air finally cooling after a scorching day, Oscar spoke for the first time since leaving Germany. His voice was small and rusty from disuse, but clear and definite. Virgil, look. A lightning bug. Both adults froze, afraid to breathe, afraid to break the spell. Virgil recovered first, his voice carefully casual, not making a big deal of it even though Martha could see the emotion in his eyes. That's right, buddy. That's a lightning bug. You want to try to catch one? Oscar nodded eagerly and scrambled off the porch, and Martha pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face in the gathering dark. Virgil reached over and squeezed her shoulder gently. He's going to be okay, Martha. You both are. You're home now. As summer turned to autumn, the town's hostility began to soften, if only slightly and slowly. Martha's quiet dignity and hard work were difficult to ignore, and Virgil's unwavering support sent a clear message to the community that she was here to stay. A few of the braver souls began to nod to Martha at church or in the general store, small gestures that meant more than they could know. One farmer, whose own son had been a prisoner of war in Germany and returned home safely with stories of decent treatment, stopped Virgil at the feed store to say he thought what Virgil was doing was decent and Christian. It wasn't much, but it was something, a crack in the wall of hostility. Mrs. Eleanor Kittredge, however, remained coldly disapproving, making pointed comments whenever she encountered them, and organizing the other women to exclude Martha from church socials and community events. Martha told herself it didn't matter, that she didn't need the approval of small-minded people, but the isolation stung nonetheless, the loneliness of being always on the outside looking in. Then came the autumn harvest, and with it, a crisis that would change everything. Virgil had hired several local men to help bring in the corn, a massive undertaking that required all hands on deck from dawn until well after dark. Martha worked alongside them, driving the truck between field and barn, hauling 100-pound bags of grain, keeping the crew fed with sandwiches and cold water and hot coffee. The men were polite but distant, uncomfortable working alongside a German woman, unsure how to treat her. On the third day of harvest, one of the workers, a young man named Dale Pritchard, Eleanor Kittredge's grandson, was operating the combine harvester when something went wrong. The machine made a terrible grinding sound and jammed, and before anyone could stop him, before anyone could shout a warning, Dale reached into the mechanism to clear the blockage without shutting down the engine first, a rookie mistake born of exhaustion and impatience. His hand was pulled into the mechanism with a sickening crunch, and his screams brought everyone running from across the field, their faces white with horror. Virgil and the other men stood frozen for a precious second, horrified by the blood and the screaming and the sight of Dale's mangled hand. But Martha didn't hesitate. She had seen worse during the bombing raids on Dresden, had helped pull people from rubble with limbs crushed and bodies broken, had learned to act when others froze because freezing meant death. She shoved past the paralyzed men, hit the emergency shutoff on the combine with shaking hands and grabbed Dale's arm to stabilize it, while yelling for someone to get the first aid kit from the truck. Dale was going into shock, his face white and sweating, his eyes rolling back, and Martha knew they had minutes before blood loss became the primary danger, before shock shut down his organs. She barked orders in a mix of German and English, her voice cutting through the panic like a knife, directing one man to apply pressure above the wound to slow the bleeding, another to bring blankets to keep Dale warm and prevent shock, another to run to the house and call for the doctor in town. She cleaned and wrapped Dale's mangled hand as best she could with the supplies available, her movements quick and sure despite her own fear, talking to him the whole time in a low, steady voice, keeping him conscious and calm, telling him he would be okay, that help was coming, that he needed to stay with her. By the time the doctor arrived 20 minutes later, his black bag in hand and his face grim, Martha had stabilized Dale enough for transport to the hospital in the next county. The doctor, an older man named Harrison who had seen his share of farm accidents and war wounds, looked at Martha's work with professional respect, checking her bandaging and her tourniquet placement. "You probably saved his hand, maybe his life," he said bluntly. "This is good work. Where did you learn field medicine?" Martha met his eyes steadily. "In Dresden, during the firebombing. There were many wounded, not enough doctors. We all learned." The doctor nodded slowly, understanding passing between them, the shared knowledge of what war does to civilians. He helped load Dale into his car, and they drove away in a cloud of dust, leaving Martha standing in the field with blood on her hands and the other workers staring at her with new eyes. The news spread through Millbrook like wildfire, growing with each retelling. The German widow had saved Eleanor Kittredge's grandson. The woman had acted while strong men stood paralyzed. She had known what to do and done it without hesitation, without thought for the fact that these were the people who had shunned her and called her enemy. When Dale returned from the hospital a week later, his hand stitched and splinted but intact and functional, the doctor saying he would regain most of its use, he insisted on visiting the farm to thank Martha personally. Eleanor Kittredge came with him, and Martha watched from the cottage window as the proud, cold woman climbed out of her car and walked slowly up the path. Martha opened the door before Eleanor could knock, and the two women stood facing each other for a long moment. Then Eleanor Kittredge, president of the Ladies' Auxiliary and keeper of social order in Millbrook, did something that must have cost her dearly. She apologized. "I was wrong about you, Mrs. Vogel. I let my grief and anger blind me to your humanity. You saved my grandson when you had every reason to turn your back on us, to let him suffer as payment for how we've treated you. I am in your debt, and I will make sure this town knows what kind of woman you are. Not a German, not an enemy, just a good woman who has suffered and survived and still has kindness left in her heart." Martha accepted the apology with grace, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and invited Eleanor inside for coffee. They sat at the small table, these two women who had lost so much to the same war, and talked haltingly about grief and loss and the difficulty of moving forward. From that day forward, the social landscape shifted dramatically. Doors that had been closed began to open. Invitations arrived for church socials and community gatherings. Women who had snubbed her at church began to smile and make conversation, asking her about recipes and farming techniques and how Oscar was adjusting. It wasn't perfect, And there were still those who would never accept her, but it was enough. It was a beginning. As winter approached, Virgil asked Martha to marry him properly. They were sitting by the fire in the main house, Oscar asleep upstairs in what had become his room over the past months. The cottage now used mostly for storage and as a guest house. Virgil had been nervous all evening, fumbling with his coffee cup, starting sentences and not finishing them. Finally, he just came out with it, his voice rough with emotion. "Martha, I know this started as a practical arrangement, just two lonely people helping each other out. But somewhere along the way, it became something more for me. You and Oscar, you've brought life back to this place, back to me. I love you. I love that boy like he was my own son. I want to make this official, make us a real family in the eyes of God and the law. Will you marry me? Will you be my wife, not just in practice, but in name?" Martha looked at this good, steady man who had given her and her son a second chance at life, who had defended them and supported them and asked nothing in return except their presence. She thought about the long journey from the ruins of Dresden to this warm farmhouse in Nebraska, about all the impossible choices and unlikely chances that had brought her here. And she realized that somewhere along the way, between the egg gathering and the harvest and the quiet evenings on the porch, she had fallen in love too. Not the passionate, desperate love of her youth, but something deeper and more solid, built on respect and shared work and mutual understanding. "Yes, Virgil," she said, her voice steady and sure. "I will marry you. I would be honored to be your wife." They were wed in a simple ceremony at the church in Millbrook 2 weeks before Christmas, with the whole town in attendance, even those who had been skeptical at first. Mrs. Eleanor Kittredge organized the reception herself, her way of making amends and signaling to the community that Martha was now one of them. The church hall was filled with food and music and goodwill, with children running between tables and old men telling stories and women admiring Martha's simple white dress that she had sewn herself from fabric Virgil had bought in town. Oscar stood beside them as Virgil's best man, solemn and proud in a new suit. And when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the boy threw his arms around both of them and held on tight, his small voice clear and strong. "I love you, Mama. I love you, Papa." Martha looked out at the faces in the congregation, no longer hostile but welcoming, no longer suspicious but accepting, and felt the last piece of her broken heart slot back into place. She was no longer the unwanted German widow. She was Martha Drummond, wife and mother and member of this community. She belonged. The years that followed were not without challenges. There were still moments when Martha's accent drew stares from strangers in the city, still times when the shadow of the war fell across their lives in unexpected ways. But Virgil and Martha built something strong together, a partnership rooted in mutual respect and hard-won love. The farm prospered under their joint management. Oscar grew into a fine young man, confident and kind, eventually taking over the farming operation when Virgil's back finally gave out after decades of hard labor. He brought his own wife to live on the land, a teacher from town named Sarah, and they filled the old farmhouse with children and laughter. Martha became a beloved figure in Millbrook, known for her kindness and her strength. The woman who had crossed an ocean and built a new life from nothing, who had turned enemies into neighbors through patience and grace. And on quiet evenings, when Virgil and Martha sat together on the porch watching the sun set over the Nebraska plains, the sky turning orange and pink and purple, Martha would sometimes think about that moment in Father Anselm's office in Hamburg, when she had been told that no family wanted an old German widow. She would think about the lonely American farmer who had raised his hand when no one else would, who had seen past nationality and age and circumstance to the human being underneath, and she would reach for Virgil's hand and hold it tight, grateful beyond words for the second chance they had given each other, for the family they had built together against all odds, for the home they had made in the most unlikely of places. They had both been broken by war, both been left alone and grieving, both been told their best days were behind them. But together, they had proven that even the most damaged hearts can heal, that even the deepest divides can be bridged, that love and family can be found in the most unexpected places if you're brave enough to take the chance. If you enjoyed this story of unlikely love and second chances, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. History is full of forgotten stories like Martha and Virgil's, stories of ordinary people finding extraordinary courage, and we'll keep bringing them to you.